Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning from Colombia. You are all very welcome to our 12th session of Global Business History Collective. Today we have Susana Martínez-Rodríguez to present Gender Differential and Financial Inclusion in Spain, Female Shareholders of Banco Hispano Americano, 1922 to 1935. This paper is co-authored with Carmen, María, Hernández-Nicolás, both from the University of Murcia. Susana is Associate Professor of Economic History at the University, and her last paper published in Business History is Mistress of Company Capital, Female Partners and Multi-Owner Firms in Spain between 1886 and 1936. Susana will present her paper for 30 minutes. Then we will open the floor for questions and answers. She will answer one question each time. And we will ask you to please keep your microphones mute during the presentation. And please remember that we are recording and distributing this video in YouTube and social media. So if you wish that your contribution is edited out, please inform the host, the conveners, or send us an email to businesshistorycollective@gmail.com. We want to also remind you that we have our website and we are now on LinkedIn. So if you want to follow us, you're very welcome. So Susana, please. It's good. We are seeing it.
Thank you. So, one moment. No, I don't think I read. So thank you for this presentation, Dr. Beatriz Rodríguez. It's a great honor and a privilege to participate in Business History Collective Spring, and I may say that it's also, and there is also a lot of pressure of doing under the slogan of the 8th of March, and I will try to do my best. First, I want to thank you all for spending your time, your precious time in this seminar. And the paper we have a current version ready for distribution, so if anyone would like to read it, we'll be more than happy and keen to receive any comment and suggestions to improve it. The index is going to be very simple. We'll start with an introduction, some context about women, banking houses, and financial environment in Spain, analysis of the sources, the results, and some very brief final remarks. So is this another paper on female shareholders, but in Spain? Well, really, we hope so. Carmen and I are looking for that. And the specific purpose of this article is to analyze the presence of female shareholders of Banco Hispano Americano, Dr. Beatriz Rodríguez said at the beginning, 1922, 1935. And Banco Hispano Americano was a leading private bank in Spain for the period, and we're going to emphasize the concept of financial inclusion in the long term. The Banco Hispano Americano was one of the major banks since the foundation in 1900s. And the list of shareholders will provide us a unique opportunity to undertake an analysis hitherto ignored in the historiography. The ultimate goal of the research is provide some answers or make some questions to broader questions on gender financial inclusion, contributing to this strand of revisionist historiography. Of what? So why? In the last year, there is a pushing in this literature related with the woman's financial wealth, and our literature that is relatively new. The main contributions are related with the contemporary economic development in the areas of the United States and the United Kingdom, and some of the more relevant parts of Europe. Because the primary source most available are the shareholders, this is the most favorite topic of study. Unfortunately, in Spain, there are few references about female wealth, and the distribution of the assets in the specialized historiography. So in certain way, this paper presents an initial scenario for studying the generation of wealth through women's financial assets in a modern financial firm in the first third of the 20th century. The paper aims to follow the footsteps of very relevant papers in the international scenario that have shown that women were first owner of financial wealth, even sometimes the quantity, the terms of this financial wealth was relevant, not specific, not isolated cases. And another guideline of the international literature is that women exhibit a pattern of behavior different to that of men. And sometimes, in a substantial number of articles, that translate into a more stable portfolio. How? In order to prove this hypothesis, we have studied the women's characteristics with shares in Banco Hispano Americano, and we've based the main part of our results in the original sources of the bank itself. Which are these main results? First, on average, the 40% of the bank shareholders were women, and they own more than a third of the share capital. Our findings suggest that in a country that was not a champion of industrialization, women's wealth was also relevant for modernization, and that modernization itself mobilized the resources towards financial.
Está en su cocina esta mujer.
Our findings also show us that there were more family ties between women than men. And this is a piece of evidence that shows that direct kinship, in particular siblings, enhance female participation, enhance financial inclusion. Another relevant result is that the even distribution of shares among siblings also favor women. Now I will give some ideas about the environment, women banking and financial environment. These images are not from Spain, probably you'll recognize them. They're images from the United States in the financial blossom of the 20s. We see shares, tickles, women in banks. Well, in Spain it was different. During the interwar period, Spaniards' financial habits did not include the consumption of modern financial products, such for example, shares. Spanish women holding shares are an example of what we name passive possession of financial wealth, resulting in most of the cases of inheritance and from the distribution of assets inside the same family. In other scenarios, the situation was different. In the United Kingdom, women all represented around 25% of total number of investors in the largest companies in the last decades of the 19th century. So can we provide a similar narrative for other regions? Not for the case of Spain, but what I can show is that at the beginning of the 20th century in Spain, even though we don't have, or at least we couldn't find, information of this caliber in terms of shares, there was, however, information that alludes of women's financial relationship with the financial sector. In the slide, you can see the front page and some elements of the inside of the Anuario Financiero, that is the financial yearbook of 1919. And in this particular volume in 1919, we will find a total of 64 private entities named, private financial entities named widow of. And even when this is not a synonymous that a woman ruled the firm, it's an indicator that in some way, because of the family ties, they were in charge or they were related with this private banking house. We can also find for Spain in a similar period another names of women who were related with bank housing, even though they were exceptions. Now I will talk about the sources. The primary source for this research are the annual reports of Banco Hispano. But first, I want to prove you that Banco Hispano is a relevant case, and the selected period is also relevant. And it's basically for two reasons. The first one is the modernization of the financial system in Spain, and the second one is the modernization of the society by itself. So the Banking Act of 1921 created a legal framework for private banks and established their competence in matters of deposits and customers. From the 20s, the number of branches grew from 270 in 1919 to almost 2,000 in 1936. This growth was related with the introduction of retail saving products and attracting people saving. And this all happened in an environment of growing modernization and where the urbanization was also growing. Other authors also emphasized that urbanization was relevant for the implication of women in other fields of the economy and the society. Looking at the original source, the Banco Hispano Americano was founded in Madrid in 1900s as a modern corporation. During the first third of the 20th century, other private banks also published similar information. They also published lists of shareholders in their annual reports. But the Banco Hispano had the value of being widely spread throughout all the country. So the shareholder lists, comparing with other official sources, comparing with census, for example, do not have the limitations of them. Because in the census, for example, there is an underestimation of the presence of women in some economic sectors. We think that the shareholders did not have that limitation. There are other limitations. If we look closer, like a primitive zoom, to the source, we'll find that the information of the report is categorized by name, family name, city of residence, and number of shares. And the type of shareholders in the Banco Hispano were basically individuals and associations. And by associations, I mean firms and other banks, some philanthropic organization. But for this period, we don't find in the Banco Hispano Americano family groups. And this is also a benefit if we are going to analyze and to analyze several reports in order to create a database. Limitations. Well, considering that our purpose is to study women, not having information about civil status or profession is a huge limitation. To give you a first approach of the database, we have 29,000 observations, and we also have the total shares. And we can see that on average, the number of shares per man is 62, but for women is 46. And this also reminds us that the portfolio of women were more modest, more smaller. We also have a second data set, and we use this for a punctual information, but we think that in terms of qualitative information is relevant. We have the minutes of the shareholder meetings, of the annual shareholder meetings. And in this information, we find that women were listed because they attended by themselves and they vote. If they have more than 20 shares, which was the minimum required, they vote. They attend, sometimes with relatives, sometimes not. If they were with families, they used to sit together, as happened in a social event. Now I'm going to explain some of the main results of the paper. At the time of the foundation, the percentage of shareholders with more than 100 shares was close to 90%. One share was pricey. We're talking about 500 pesetas. And according to Tortella and García Ruiz, which are the most relevant scholars that analyze the Banco Hispano Americano, 500 pesetas for the 30s means 1 month of salary of a qualified employee, for example, in a bank. I want to introduce the first couple of the afternoon. Let me introduce Bruno Zaldo Rivera and Victoria Arana Villar. Bruno Zaldo was one of the founding members of this bank, and he was an important shareholder, and several members of his family, they also have shares in the bank. So him and his network of influence control an important number of shares. And he was not the only one who used this strategy to control shares. But when we arrive to the 1920s, we find that the situation is slightly different. There is a period of, let's say, democratization in the number of the shareholders. From 1922 to 1935, there is an increase in the number of shareholders, and their portfolio became every time smaller. The table 1 displays this information, an overall view of the database. And the evolution in the number of shareholders reflect the bank expectations, rising from 2,900 shareholders in 1922, which is the first year of our period of study, to 3,800 shares in 1935. The percentage of women shareholders increased also in the same direction, from 36% in 1922 to more than 45% on the eve of the Civil War. And the increase was also reflected in the capital shares. Why? Well, trying to find some contextualization of this increase, of the increasing in the number of female shareholders, we have to say that urbanization was also growing. The number of branches in the cities will also expand. The proliferation of cities and also the urban bourgeoisie generated also a more favorable climate towards women's rights and their historical acceptability. And with the Constitution of 1931, women also conquered civil rights and also the historic milestone of the vote. And in a certain way, there was also a mirror effect in other parts of the economy. There are other works that emphasize that in the same period, there was also a greater female presence in the business sphere. Although we have to say that women were never numerous, but they were increased their presence. And this could be considered a sign of economic modernization and also a democratized access to the capital. In graph 1, we display the women shareholders by share intervals and totals. And the trend in all groups is clearly positive. Women were represented throughout the investor spectrum, from the modest savers with less than 20 shares. We have to remember that more than 20 shares, they have access to the vote, to women from prominent families, that have a very important portfolio. The increase in female owners of portfolios with more than 500 shares was in certain way sharp, rising from more than a third in the last year of our database, which is 1935. Meanwhile, the largest segment of women would be found in the smaller section of shareholders, those with less than 20 shares. And probably these shareholders, particularly female shareholders with less than 20 shares, are those who were looking for a saving and stable income. Supporting the same idea, we present the information of the minutes of the general shareholder meeting. And they show the same idea. They show that there is an increase in the number of women that attend to these meetings. Although I have to say that in the minutes, there was not a direct female intervention recorded. The attendance by itself is also a lens through which to study the social role of women in the period, how was changing that social role of women. And as I said before, the results of what was happening, the presence of women in the general shareholder meeting are similar to those that we see before in the total of the bank. I mean, the female shareholder by shares intervals and totals. By the supply side, we can say that what is behind this increase of the presence of female shareholders, on one side could be the increase of the number of branches. If, for example, in 1918 we have 20, and in 1935 we have 150 branches of Banco Hispano all around of Spain. And the profit that provided these shares was also interesting. The dividend of the Banco Hispano were higher than those in other similar entities. On average, the Banco Hispano dividends in the 1920s was around 10%. And for other relevant banks in Spain, for example, I have the note of the central bank, was 7%. One last consideration is about the distance of the shareholder address to a branch of the Banco Hispano. In table 2, we show how many shareholders live near a Banco Hispano office. And we only focus on the example of the beginning of the period and the last of the period. So for 1922, we have that the 73% of male shareholders live in a locality with a Banco Hispano branch, or Banco Hispano office. And in the case of women, the proportion was a little higher. So this could be a slight indicator of this gender factor. But in 1932, the gender factor disappeared. I mean, we find that in 1932, for men and for women, the percentage is the 80%. We mentioned before the strategy of the Faldo family of allocating shares among their members. They were not the only ones. Here I will introduce the second protagonist of the afternoon. This is the picture of the family of Pero Gordo family. And I want to emphasize this example because it helped me to explain how kinship is relevant. We think it's relevant in this database. When the father of the family, Genaro Pero Gordo, passed away, the number of shares of the kids, she has one daughter and one son, the number of shares increased, and increased more or less in the same proportion, meaning that when he passed away, the kids inherit the shares and they split the shares. Not exactly, but that's the idea. What we observed in this particular example of Genaro Pero Gordo, who was a relevant citizen, he was MP, later senator, the owner of a newspaper. The intuition is that happened with more people in the bank, more shareholders. So to conduct this part of the analysis, we create a new variable. And this variable is, we name it siblings. So this is the hypothesis. If two or more persons share the same family names, we can say that they have a direct link, more particularly that they are siblings. So two facts support this assumption. The first one is that in Spain, we keep the same order of the surnames, the first for the father and the second for the mother. And men and women keep this order in the family names. And we know that this assumption is very strong because first, we are only consider one possibility of being related, one possibility of family tie. And there is also a chance of committing a mistake. Maybe with these family names, no, because we know that who they are, we know that they were relevant. But there are a lot of people that is lost in history, so we cannot track if they are or not effectively siblings. But going ahead with this hypothesis, we find that there are 2,100 shareholders with this characteristic, and the 52% of them were women. And the composition by sex of this, let's say, families, group of individuals with the same family names, suggests that the incidence rate of women was slightly higher than that of men. And this is also a relevant fact for us. We can examine the same fact in a different way. In table 3, we examine the representation of these siblings by sex and by share intervals. And we find that in the case of women, family ties were higher when the number of the shares that they possessed was lower. Meanwhile, in the case of men, kinship was relevant as higher was the portfolio. One last result to emphasize is related with how these shares were distributed among siblings. And we find that the equalitarian inheritance in certain way favors women. So what we do is we compare each individual's number of shares with their sibling arithmetic mean. So in the case of Berta Pero Gordo, we will compare the stock of shares of Berta Pero Gordo with the arithmetic mean of Berta Pero Gordo plus Augusto, that is, the both siblings. And in this case, we find that a total of 5,000 individuals keep this characteristic. I mean, the distribution of the shares among siblings is the same. And again here, the presence of women is overwhelming. More than the 85% of women have a volume of assets similar to their siblings. And even though this is an intuition, also emphasize the idea that family ties are relevant in the possession of shares, at least for this particular case of Banco Hispano Americano. To conclude this presentation, I only would like to highlight two ideas. The evidence from Banco Hispano situates women as a relevant group of shareholders, as already happened in other Western countries. The emphasis in this particular case is in the strength is in the modernization of the economy and the modernization of the financial system. And another point relevant for the Banco Hispano is the emphasis on the family ties. The emphasis on family ties does not necessarily have to diminish or overlook the woman's role. And because in certain way, this is a fair approach, and it's a way to start to understand how was the distribution of the financial shares in Spain, and how was the role of women in this modernization of the economy and the mobilization of their wealth. With this, I will finish my presentation. I remember that I packed with Adam 25 minutes, and if I am right, I keep it, and I will finish here. Thank you for your attention. I will be very happy if you have some comments to help us to improve this current version of the paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susana. Yes, you exactly took 25 minutes, which is actually very good. Thank you. Okay, we have two questions to start. We have a question from Liliana Hurtado. Basically, she's asking shareholders in the case of the Banco Hispano Americano in middle and upper class people. Why are you using the term financial inclusion, as it seems this is a modern term that implies the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid? So it's a little bit to expand on the term financial inclusion. And Gabriela Recio asked, do you know if the women actually were able to buy the shares, or did a husband or father buy the shares for them?
Okay, thank you very much. Shall I answer, Beatriz?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for both questions.
Sorry, can I just suggest we stop sharing the screen so we can...
Yes. Sorry, Adam. It's okay? According to my computer, I just stopped to share the screen.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. So thank you very much for both comments. And regarding the first one, it's something that puzzled me a lot about the term financial inclusion. We consider the term financial inclusion as the inclusion of women in the financial system. And in the paper, we argue that the fact that women acquire shares, is also a term of financial inclusion. We totally agree with the professor that in other modern studies, they emphasize that financial inclusion is a term bottom up. But in this case, in this historical context, I understand that the fact that we find women sharing, trading with shares, which maybe trading is not the most adequate term, considering how is the behavior, the stable behavior of this woman in the Banco Hispano, we think it's also relevant and show us how the mobilization of female wealth is relevant for the modernization. Still, I have to say that I agree with the comment. I think it's a precision that is important to make in the paper, and it's a term of honesty to include that there is also a very relevant literature that emphasizes with this focus bottom up. Thank you. The second one I forget.
Gabriela asked you if, do you know if the women actually were able to buy the shares, or did a husband or father buy the shares for them?
That's a good one. Okay, that's also a very good idea. So in Spain, there was no limitation for women to access to the property, to this kind of property. We do not manage archive information that show us how they buy the shares, but they know they have rights to buy it. Other thing is that they were married, they have to have the consent of the husband. That's another thing. But in other paper also emphasized the idea that in Spanish, under the Spanish civil law, the fact of being able to, have this access of the financial wealth, real help to the incorporation of women in the, real help to the incorporation of women in the business sector. So the short answer is yes. Even when I have to say, I cannot prove the professor that I have a document of archive that show how they buy the shares. That is true. That's true.
Thank you.
Jose Luis Garcia asked, do you know if the situation changed during the Franco era?
Oh, is Professor Garcia, Jose Luis Garcia?
Sí.
Well, as everybody know in the room, he is one of the most relevant scholars in Banco Hispano, so that's a lot of pressure. So we only focus in this particular period in the 1920s and 1930s, so I cannot provide that answer. And I have to say that even when I have more primary sources from Banco Hispano, I do not have any record from the 40s. I do not have records from the 40s, so I cannot answer that for Banco Hispano. We are working in another bank, so probably in, let's say, a couple of years, we'll have information from the Franco period and female shareholders during the Franco period. Thank you.
Okay, while anyone else thinks about the question, I am going to use my role of chair to ask you one. You mentioned that with the surnames, you are identifying siblings. However, can you identify also husband and wife, and to check if the family keeps investing in the bank?
That was the big thing of the paper, Beatriz. No, the question is that, that is the worst thing. The question is that considering the resources and time available and pressure to publish, we have to be focusing in the records of the shareholders. And in the record of the shareholders, we got it was impossible for us to allocate, to localize information of husbands. I have information of some husbands, some widows, some relevant widows of the community, but not in a systematic way. So thinking of how to make this systematic, we find that, and we explain this with a lot of honesty in the paper. If we match the family name first and second, we can create this variable, which is siblings. And we also recreate this with a relevant, which is probably the worst of all, which are the Garcia. Garcia is the most common family name in Spain, no? So if you find someone that named Garcia Lopez Pedro, and you find another person named Garcia Lopez Maria, well, that means nothing, okay? But even for that cases, we find that, well, the coincidence were, no, the results, maybe the first was Garcia, the second was Itugarri or De La Rosa. And we quote some literature that say that considering how no common are the family names, that means that the probability of being part of a similar group is higher. So we think that we assume and we accept that is a limitation that matches the family names in this sense can create mistakes of identification, but still the numbers, it's a lot. I mean, we have 29,000 observations and we have 12,000 individuals that share family names. And that's the reason what we emphasize is a hypothesis, but is at least with our resources is the best that we can do. We have particular cases of husbands. Okay. That's the one that I mentioned before of Bruno Faldo and Victoria Arana. But you know, there are only few.
Okay, Bernardo asked, can you attempt a geographic distribution of shareholders and then look at where women are located? How much concentration of shareholders are in Madrid?
Oh, Madrid is a great example. In 1922, Carmen and I were talking about this yesterday evening, very late. So in 1922, and I think Carmen is around, so if I'm doing wrong, she can stop me. So in 1922, there is 1,000 shareholders, female shareholders, 1,000 something. And surprise, 500 of them were in Madrid. So it seems that demographic really matters and matters a lot. Now, in the paper, we don't have a geographic distribution, but it's a great suggestion, and we'll try to improve it to implement it in the paper. Thank you.
Any other question? Hazel, I see your hand raised. If you want to ask the question, please.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Susana. That was really interesting. I was particularly interested when you were talking about the fact that women attended the shareholder meetings. And also you said a little bit about that they were sitting in family groups or whatever. So my first question is, how do you know that? And also in terms of the minutes not reflecting women speaking, well, could you see in the minutes that it was common for lots of the male shareholders to contribute, or did they also not really speak that much? And just a third question, were shareholders allowed to vote and participate by proxy as they were in England or not?
Thank you. So we find this information of minutes, well, in part thanks to Professor José Luis Garcia, that in a meeting told me, hey, you have to look for this. And then I tried to locate this information of the minutes. And I say that the shareholders were sitting by groups because of the way that they were named in the minutes. So it's not in a strictly alphabetical order as it happened in the reports. So that's where I say that. First thing. No, not all the shareholders participate in the exposition in the shareholder meeting. I think only the most relevant one that used to happen. And third, regarding the votation by proxy, when I analyzed this source, a source that was provided for the Archivo de Banco Santander, I was not focused in that. So my lecture was not very detailed. So maybe I'm not being maybe I'm not telling all the truth right now. But for the list of the shareholders, I remember that when they were in the meeting representing other members, there was a note that say, again, my example, García López Pedro, comma, representing his wife, for example. Yes, they did it. Yes.
I see. Can I just ask a very quick question, another question, if I may, which is just, you showed you gave an indication that there was a localization effect, especially early on, with maybe women buying shares where there was a branch close to them. And you said that there were branches, there was a lot of expansion. Was that all over Spain, or was it more located just in the big cities or in a certain region, or was it just generally everywhere?
From this particular period, at the end of the period, we have around 150 branches, offices, and that is scattered all over Spain. And the preference for urban areas. But the concept of urban, we also explain this. Let's say that we call urban more than 10,000 inhabitants, This is the sense of urban here. Well, this is the one that we use in the paper. And regarding the hypothesis of proximity, it's a great suggestion. We only make a first approach. We take the year 1922 and then the year 1932, and we find that because the effect disappeared, we didn't want to go farther in this hypothesis. That maybe you're right, and it's a good idea. Invest more time and try to make it more systematic.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other question?
Yeah, I could jump in with one if I may.
Okay, Adam, go.
Yeah, thanks very much. I sort of had the same question as Hazel, but I'll move on to a slightly different one. So obviously we've got these female shareholders who are encouraged to buy shares in the Banco Hispano, and I wondered, appreciate this falls well into your specified limitations, but to what extent do we know what might have been some of the things that encouraged them to do that, in addition perhaps to these increasing branches? Were they particularly good at marketing? Were there certain intermediary relationships that perhaps encouraged movement? Was there something more of a sort of social buzz around that institution? I wanted to know whether there was, even if it's more anecdotal, any more sort of understanding of how this sort of movement occurred over that time.
Well, I do not remember use the word encouraging to buy shares, because I think that I mentioned it at the beginning, and if not, sorry, forgive me. Our guess is that the possession of shares is quite passive, and that's the reason why we emphasize the role of the family. So if you have that with these presumptuous siblings, 12, you have a total of 29,000 shareholders. 12,000 of them are potentially siblings. Around 6,500 of them are women. We find that the main part of the shareholders who are women because of this family allocation of resources. And my intuition is that there is a distribution of shares inside the family, the distribution of wealth inside the family. And because we are in a more urban environment, in a no-urban environment, is relevant focus the inheritance of the house in one member. And at least in Spain, that member used to be a man and a primogenitor. But now with the modernization and with the transfer of people to a more urban environments, this strategy of reproduction have no sense anymore. And there is a spread of the wealth among the members of the family. So at the current moment, I think that the context of modernization is positive to allow this higher participation of women in the financial market. But with the evidence that I have right now, I will not say that they were active buyers of shares. I will not say. On the other hand, I do not have information about wives, as Beatriz said before. And that is also a limitation to know how is the allocation of resources inside a marriage. I don't know if I can satisfy any of your multiple questions.
No, thank you. I picked up on your earlier point about the inheritance of the family structure. I just wondered why, whether there was something in addition to that. And
for now, I cannot
really
find.
Interesting that you have this passive aspect, that you have clearly a very important group of people from a shareholder perspective and from a capital perspective, but that they sit very passively and they don't have that active involvement, and they're not necessarily driving a particular agenda. But thank you.
No, I don't think they are driving a particular agenda with the current information. I mean, maybe if we will have in the future more information about other banks, we can be more ambitious. But for now, I think that emphasize the idea of the family connections, I think it's more fair and more honest considering the sources.
Susana, we have two more questions, one from Ana Rosado and then Hazel. We have Ana asked, can you tell us your intuition about the real power of women in the bank? I think you have covered a little bit, but if you want to expand it. Yeah.
Well, I do not have real intuition. I have the impression, and we also quote it in the paper, that they were a silent shareholders in certain way, making a joke with the silent members of a firm. I think they were silent owners. And even though I did not read the minutes with detail, I read all the reports with detail, and I can assure you there is no line mentioning that the 40% of the shareholders were women. I am totally sure of that. linked with the idea of the professor about the power of women in the financial system. I think it was in the 40s when a woman was, I don't know, I'm not very sure, but I think it was in Banco de la Coruña that the woman take care of the presidency for a short period. The name was Carmen. And also, to give an example, we know about women that were main shareholders in private banks for a similar period. For example, another bank from Galicia, in the north of Spain, Banco Limpio Pérez, the capital was divided among the shareholders, and the main shareholders were the 8 sons of Olimpio Pérez. At least 3 of them were women, and they were significant shareholders who take decisions in the bank. That's what I can add for this particular period. And thank you. It's a good point also to add.
Hazel?
Hello, me again. Sorry, just a quick question. One of the, my work is on shareholders in Victorian England, female shareholders. And one of the things that's often talked about why there was that increase of women participating in capital markets is that there were certain types of shares that made it less risky. And you mentioned the fact that these shares had a wonderful dividend of over 10%. And also you've talked about the family connections. But I wonder, are you talking here about just ordinary shares, or are there the equivalent of things like preference shares, those kind of things with the bank as well that reduced the risk attached to them?
Very good one. In the information of the reports of the bank, we only have one type of shares. There is no distinction between shares A and shares B. For example, in a smaller bank, in Banco de Irún, there is more differentiations in shares. But in the particular information for Banco Hispano, they only mention shares. We don't have this distribution about type 1 or type B. Okay. So I cannot provide more information in that sense.
Okay, thank you.
Pleasure.
Any other question?
Well, thank you very much for all the comments. I mean, I think they will help me a lot. And even when I didn't take note, because this is recording, I can go one and over the recording and take good note of your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Susana, for your presentation. Really good. And
thank you very much.
I hope everything helps you with your paper. And thank you, everyone, for coming today. I just want to remind you that the next webinar, please give me 1 second. The next one is on the 23rd of March on benefits offered by historical explanation to statistical studies in strategic management. The presenters will be Sandeep Pillai of Bocconi University and Brent Coulthard and David Kirsch of the University of Maryland. So I hope you all can come.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Don't go.
Don't go?
Don't go.